Hi everybody, Dr. Hall. We're moving into our final section of lecture 6, part 2 of the brain, talking about its different regions. 6C is diencephalon and cerebrum. So here we are. This is the end of the lecture. So diencephalon. The diencephalon is deep in the center of the brain. So you may not have learned about it in high school biology class because it's not easy to see. And it's divided into basically 3 parts based on functions. There's no visual distinct separation between these different regions, but there are functional differences. And remember, of course, the diencephalon developed from the prosencephalon, so that superior part of the brain that the cerebrum also developed from. So this is kind of higher order stuff. So the first part that I want to draw your attention to is the hypothalamus. Hypo as a prefix means less than or beneath, and it is beneath the thalamus, which is another part of the diencephalon. So the hypothalamus shown here in green, let me get my pen. So the hypothalamus here in the green section is really crucial for our bodies. So it's really important in homeostasis, in regulating our hormonal system, which is called the endocrine system, and our autonomic nervous system, which has a lot to do with blood pressure and heart rate and moving things through our intestines and urination and defecation, all kinds of things. So it also regulates body temperature, hunger, thirst, sexual function, and the hypothalamus is involved in some emotional and memory responses to odors, which is kind of fun and neat. We all have certain smells that take us back or make us think of a person or a time in our lives. Then let's talk about the thalamus. So kind of moving up from, where's my pen? I don't know. Oh, there it is. Okay. So here's the thalamus in the center. So you might remember that the third ventricle is in that space between the thalamus on each side of the brain. And the thalamus has a lot of relay tracts. So it's sending a lot of information up to the brain, but it's choosy. It's picky about it. So one of the things that the thalamus does is it kind of screens out extraneous, unimportant information, sensory information that's coming in, like perhaps how your sock feels on your foot right now. Which until I brought it up to you, you probably weren't thinking about it at all because your thalamus was suppressing that information. But now that I've drawn your attention to it, your thalamus is like, oh, it must be important. Let it go through. So the thalamus kind of acts like a triage center because otherwise we would be overwhelmed with all of the sensory information coming in at any given moment. So this is going to be really important for helping us to focus on tasks and only pay attention to the information that's coming in that's important. Thalamus. Then the third and final part is the epithalamus. There's my pen. So it's kind of back here. So you might remember that the prefix epi means kind of above and outside of. So you see this is just kind of behind where the thalamus is. And it contains the pineal gland. And it is the pineal gland that secretes melatonin, which is the hormone that helps regulate our circadian rhythm, our sense of when it's day and when it's night. So if you've ever worked night shifts or if you've ever traveled internationally, you're familiar with jet lag, kind of being out of sync with that normal day-night circadian rhythm. So pretty important there. So that's the diencephalon. I didn't do a summary slide, sorry. So hypothalamus, really important for homeostasis and controlling the endocrine system. Thalamus is kind of like a triage center, filters out the sensory information that's not important, lets the important sensory information come up to our conscious awareness. And then the epithalamus has the pineal gland, which secretes melatonin for our circadian rhythm. So talking about the cerebrum, a few general concepts to start off. One is that the cerebrum is in fold. So it is the big wrinkly part of the brain. And that is because all of the neurons are in one continuous sheet. So I've got a little napkin here. So they're in one continuous layer or sheet. But in order to fit those all in our skull, you kind of like fold them all up into these little folds. And then you can get it into a small space. So the parts where the folds are heaped up, those are called the gyri, and then the little valleys in between are called the sulci. So gyri is plural, gyrus is singular, sulcus is singular, sulci is plural. And this allows for just lots of surface area. We can pack more neurons in there. And that outer rind, which is gray matter, remember, so that's gray matter, those neuron cell bodies are often referred to as the cerebral cortex. So you'll hear a lot of like the such and such cortex, the such and such cortex. That's that outer rind of gray matter made up of neuron cell bodies that's kind of doing the work. And there's a picture of it. So remember, the cerebral cortex that you're going to keep hearing about is where the neuron cell bodies are. So I like to think of it kind of like balloons, right? So the balloons are kind of all up on the top layer, and then their axons are like the strings of the balloons hanging down. That's kind of how I conceptualize the arrangement of the cerebral cortex. And there it is again. So you can see all those strings. Look at them. So many strings. There are a couple of other things about the cerebrum. One is that we have some fissures, which are really big grooves or divisions, and then sulci, which are, those little valleys in between the folds, some of which are important, so they have special names. So the first one I want to draw your attention to is the longitudinal fissure. So the longitudinal fissure is, did I say that right? Longitudinal fissure is right down the middle here. That does not work. I have to use the pen. It's right down the middle here, and it separates the two halves of the cerebrum from each other. You have seen this on the brains already because the superior sagittal sinus ran right over top of it, and the falx cerebri, that fold of the dura mater, extended down into it, just a tiny bit in the sheep brain we saw. Then if we look, so here's a side view. That previous view, I apologize, was kind of a top-down view of the brain, or a superior view. Now we're looking at a lateral view. We can see a couple of other structures. So first of all, I want to draw your attention to this big groove here. This is called the lateral fissure, or sometimes called the transverse fissure. You'll see both terms used. The Hedges textbook uses lateral fissure. And so there's that one, and it happens to separate some of the lobes of the cerebrum. And then also up here, we have the central sulcus, and the central sulcus is also separating some other lobes. And so we'll be looking for those when we look at the brains. So I mentioned the cerebrum is in these two hemispheres, or two sides. They are connected by a band of white matter. We're going to talk about that in a moment. And then they are divided into these four lobes. So if I draw in, where's my pen? If I draw in, here is the central sulcus right here. And then here is the lateral fissure, sometimes called the transverse fissure, right there. And of course, the longitudinal fissure is right here in between the two halves of the cerebrum. Okay. So the cerebrum is divided into these two hemispheres, these two hemispheres, half of a sphere. It's kind of spherical, I suppose, but they do have a connection between them. So there is a band of white matter, so that means axons, myelinated axons, that runs from one side of the cerebrum to the other. So this view on the left here is a superior view, where it's a top-down view, and you can see here is this band of white matter. It's called the corpus callosum, which in Latin honestly just means big thing. Corpus means a body or a thing. Colossum means like big. It's colossal. So it's just big thing. Anyway, and if we look at a sagittal view, when we kind of cut the brain in half, you have to cut through the corpus callosum. Here it is here. It's this very wide band. Think of like a really wide belt that runs from the one cerebrum to the other so that they can communicate and know what each of them are doing. So those two halves of the cerebrum are mostly symmetric, and they have mostly the same equipment and the same types of functions. Now, you may have heard, oh, I'm left-brained, I'm logical, I'm analytical, she's right-brained, she's creative and free-thinking. No. So that's kind of a myth, right? So they've done studies to look to see if people with different types of personalities use one side of their brain more than the other. And in fact, no, there is no evidence to support that. If you were a fan of the band Rush, though, their album Hemispheres was pretty awesome. And look, they've got your, artsy right-sided and analytical, stuffy left-sided person. I thought it was kind of cute. It's a good album. But for the most part, the only difference that's between the right and the left side of the cerebrum is the fact that the right side of the brain is communicating with the left side of the body, and the left side of the brain is communicating with the right side of the body. So that crossing of tracks. So that's obviously a difference. But there is also a difference in the centers for speech and language. So in most people, those are housed on the left side of the brain and not on the right. So that is one exception to the fact that these mostly can all do the same kind of stuff. But language and speech seems to be localized on the left side for most people. Let's talk about the different lobes then. So again, the different cortexes, depending on which lobe they are in. This is a super brief overview because, I've been talking a lot already, and we're going to get into more detail when we study each of these systems individually. So the frontal lobe, so named because it is on the front of the brain. So we have the frontal lobe here, and look, here's that central sulcus, which is separating it from the lobe posterior to it. Here is that transverse fissure separating it from the lobe that is inferior to it. And so the frontal lobe has a lot of different functions. It is very involved in planning and decision making. We often call this executive function, right? It's like the CEO, it's kind of making all these decisions. It's also important in moderating social behavior and personality. So Phineas Gage, famously, his frontal lobe was severely damaged. And so the hypothesis is that that is why there was a significant difference in his personality and social behavior. You may be interested to know that this is also the first part of your brain that alcohol impairs when you drink alcohol. So alcohol is a suppressant, a depressant. And so sometimes people are like, well, then why do people get wild and crazy? Because it suppresses the part of your brain that says, that's probably not a good idea. So that's the frontal lobe. But then the frontal lobe also has all of the centers involved in voluntary movement. So frontal lobe is not only kind of executive functions, personality, decision making, it is also movement. And we'll spend a whole week talking about movement systems in the body. The parietal lobe, so again, coming now posterior to the central sulcus, we have the parietal lobe, which is located underneath the parietal bone. I love that. It's all about somatosensory. So what's somatosensory? So somatosensory is somato, which means body, sensory, senses. So senses that are coming from the body. So these are senses other than your special senses, other than like sight and taste and hearing. And vision, right? Sight, vision, same thing. So sensations that are coming from your body, touch, pain, right? You're feeling some water. All of that information is coming into the parietal lobe where it's received and processed. We will also find a taste center here in the parietal lobe, so it is involved with one of those special senses as well. The temporal lobe, located underneath the temporal bone. So again, just to review, here is the central sulcus that separates the frontal and the parietal lobes. Here is that lateral fissure that is separating those two from the temporal lobe. And the temporal lobe is got all of the centers for kind of our hearing. So receiving information, auditory information from our ears and processing that. It also has some important centers for memory and for language. Again, primarily on the left side. That is one of those weird places where we're not completely symmetrical. And then finally, in the back, the most posterior lobe we have is the occipital lobe, located underneath the occipital bone, and that is all about vision. So we can see here in this diagram, you've got your eye, you've got the optic nerve, bringing that sensory information from the eyeball back into the brain. It's going to stop a couple places along the way, but it's going to end up back here in the visual cortex of the occipital lobe. So in summary, the cerebral cortex, the cerebrum, we have two hemispheres connected by that corpus callosum, that band of white matter. It's almost entirely symmetric with the exception of that contralateral organization. Right side communicates with left side of the body, left side communicates with the right side of the body, and the fact that the speech and language centers are almost always on the left side. Remember that that cerebral cortex is folded to allow for increased surface area. The gyri are the humped up parts, the sulci are the little valleys in between. The frontal lobe is got our motor functions as well as those executive functions like planning and decision making as well as personality. Parietal lobe is senses from the body, so touch and pain and a whole bunch of other things, as well as taste. Temporal lobe for hearing, memory, and language, and the occipital lobe is all about vision. So that is a very broad strokes overview of the cerebrum, and that's the end of lecture 6. Thanks.